Hello, I'm Richard Gizbert, and you're at The Listening Post. We're breaking format this week with a special program on Palestine and Israel. The violence that spiraled through the month of May, the dispossession of Palestinians from Jerusalem, the blood that was shed at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the renewed brutal onslaught on Gaza, and the stories of resistance all sounded uncomfortably familiar. But for a change, it seemed like the world was listening, watching. This program is about who they're listening to. Young Palestinians asserting themselves online and penetrating the mainstream media by documenting their realities. Human rights organizations finally seeing legacy media outlets adopting the kind of language, terms like apartheid, that apply to the occupation. A few days after the ceasefire in Gaza, we spoke with two Palestinians who have tilted international attention towards their struggle. From Gaza, photographer Hosam Salem, whose images captured the bombings and the after effects. But we start with Sheikh Jarrah resident and activist Munna al-Kurd, whose showdowns with armed Jewish settlers who were backed by Israeli police put her East Jerusalem neighborhood on the map. When watching Munna al-Kurd, keep in mind, she is 23 years old.
Breaking news overnight in Israel. Police are bracing for more protests and clashes with Palestinians today.
Israeli settler groups have been trying to get Palestinian families evicted from their homes in this area for years.
The current tensions were sparked partly by this viral video in which local woman Munna al-Kurd confronts a Jewish settler.
Jacob, you know this is not your house.
Yes, but if I go, you don't go back. So what's the problem? Why are you yelling at me?
احنا بنتقاتل على وجودنا في هاي الارض. هو عارف انه هذا بيتي، لكن صراحه ما توقعت يحكي هيك، ابدا ما توقعت يحكي هيك. You are stealing my house.
And if I don't steal it, someone else is going to steal it.
ما بعرف اذا عن جد بدي احكي انه ربنا انطقه وخلاه يحكي، بس يعقوب السبب انه انتشر الفيديو بهذا الشكل الهائل انه شهد شاهد من اهله، مستوطن اسرائيلي امريكي بالاساس جاي من نيويورك، استولى على منزل وسرقه واعترف بلسانه، عرف ما هي المنظومة الاحتلالية الاستعمارية التي نعيش تحتها. عالم عشان يشوفوا شو اللي عماله بيحصل معانا. اللي عمالي بصوره خاصة اليوم بعد ما الناس عمالها بتتوجه لصفحتي خلينا أقول مصدر موثوق للمعلومات، عمالي بصور الانتهاكات بحق أهالي الحي والمؤازرين. نديهم بوثق اعتداءات المستوطنين، كمان عمالي بوثق كيف قوات الاحتلال بتاخذ أوامرها من المستوطنين وكيف بتقوم بحمايتهم.
أيوة تعال دافع عنه تعال.
كيف نظام الفصل العنصري اللي عمالهم بيقيموه علينا، الإغلاق غير القانوني المفروض على الحي، كل هاي التفاصيل حياتنا اليومية.
يا جماعة في صحفيين اللي هم من حملة بطاقة النقابة الفلسطينية منعوهم يدخلوا، فأنا دخلت لهم الكاميرا عشان أصور لهم كم لقطة لأنه منعينهم يدخلوا. فإحنا بدنا هلا
يعني في كل مرة أنا كمنى أو غيري من النشطاء والإعلاميين اللي بيحاولوا يغطوا ما يحدث في حي الشيخ جراح من انتهاكات واعتداءات المستوطنين وقوات الاحتلال، بيتم منعهم والتضييق عليهم. الصحفيين بيمنعوهم حتى يدخلوا على الحي، والنشطاء بيحاولوا يغطوا على الكاميرات، يدفشونا، يبعدونا، ما تقربيش.
حكيت معه قبل ما حكيت معك.
بس احنا اليوم اللي عمالنا بنحكيه انه انا لنكبتي الا تستمر، خلص زهقنا، ما بدنا نعيد هاي النكبه، ما بدي ارجع اعيش بخيمه انا واهلي وجيراني، ما بدنا هذا الاشي يصير. ففعلا حيفا اللي تهجرنا منها ويافا وسرفند الخراب وكل هاي المناطق شو كانت؟ ما كانت الشيخ جراح بشي مرحلة، كانت مدينة عربية أصيلة اللي تهجروا سكانها منها صارت إسرائيلية. وهيك تيصير بالشيخ جراح لا سمح الله، وبسلوان وكمان بمناطق كثير مختلفة كمان من أحياء القدس. لكل العالم تعرف إنه إحنا رمز الصبر والصمود. إلنا 49 سنة في محاكم الاحتلال، قصتنا مش جديدة، وكنا شوكة في كل هاي السنوات في حلق الاحتلال ورح نضل.
The epicenter is the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, one of the holiest sites in Islam under Israeli control.
Chaos and confrontation inside the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound as Israeli police fire stun grenades to disperse Muslim worshippers.
Predictably, Israel was quick to respond and hard.
الشعور الحقيقي كان انه يعني عن جد انا لسه ما طلعت من غزة. انا جيت على المكان اللي انا ما غادرته اصلا، يعني 3 سنين هدول كانوا زي كأنه ما حكيت لك انه انا نايم وصحيت. في الحروب اللي قبل وفي التصعيدات اللي قبل كانت وفي الأيام القصف المستمرة على غزة كان القصف لبيت لبيتين 3 بيوت. المرة هاي ال10 أيام حرب هدول يقصف البيت، يقصف مفترق الشارع اللي أمامه، يقصف على مساحة مربع كامل. يتم قصف 25 غارة في نفس الوقت. المرة هاي صار رعب انه انا قاعد بيصير امامي مسح لمربعات سكنية كاملة. أنا برأيي كمصور أو كحدا ساكن في قطاع غزة إنه قصف الأبراج هو ضغط أكبر على المواطنين، على سكان غزة، على المقاومة اللي موجودة في غزة، إنه هي إحنا قادرين نشرد 200 عيلة في لحظة. قصف الأبراج ما أعتقد في حدا في غزة ممكن يقتنع إنه هذا قصف الأبراج لأنه في شقق لحماس أو للجهاد أو للمقاومة بشكل عام. في أول يوم الحرب عملت لصالح موقع الجزيرة الإنجليزية، قمت بتغطية استهداف برج سكني في وسط حي الرمال. كان في صور الناس وهي بتشرد قاعدة بتخلي من المنطقة هاي، وكان في صور وداع وصور ناس نازلة بلبس الصلاة عشان تشرد من المنطقة. ثاني يوم والأيام الباقية اشتغلت لصالح نيويورك تايمز. بعض الصور اللي التقطتها وطبعت في الصفحة الأولى وطبعت في الصفحات الأخرى كان منها مثلا جنازة ناجي من عائلة إشكن تناخ في قصف مربع شارع الوحدة. العائلة استشهدت الأم و4 أطفال، الأب ناجي وحيد أحضروه وهو مصاب ولسه الدم يعني بارز على جسمه. أجا يودع عائلته أثناء الوداع. قمت بالتقاط صورة معبرة وتم طباعتها على الصفحة الأولى. احنا كنا نعاني، سواء احنا صحفيين سواء انه سكان المنطقة، اي شيء متحرك في غزة كان بيعاني وبيعاني بشكل كبير جدا، وكان التخوف في انه في اي لحظة ممكن يفقد حياته. على مدار تقريبا 15 سنة أو 16 سنة بنحاول كمصورين صحفيين أنه ننقل الصورة اللي بتعبر عن الحصار المفروض على قطاع غزة. ممكن يعني صار عندنا اللي هو تكرار الصورة على مدار هذه السنوات، لدرجة أنه الناس اللي برا اللي بنشتغل معهم حفظوا إيش الصورة اللي بتطلع من غزة. الناس تعبت من الحصار المفروض عليهم منذ 15 عام، وإحنا حاولنا نترجم هذا الشيء من خلال صورنا. قطاع غزة منطقة مليئة بالأحداث الحربية يعني أحداث الحرب، أحداث الشهداء، الأحداث اللي جارية من قبل الاحتلال الصهيوني على فلسطين بشكل عام. وأحيانا إحنا بنضطر نشرد من هذه الأحداث لنقل الحياة. إحنا دائما بنحمل اللي هي مقولة على هذه الأرض ما يستحق الحياة، بنحاول نترجمها من خلال الصور تاعتنا، فبنحاول ننقل الصورة اللي محببة للحياة من خلال هذه الأشياء.
تقلقيش منى، حكيت معها منى تقلقيش. شدي حالك خفيشي. هلا ببعتك محامي،
والحمد لله يا ربي. كمان وحده يا خالد، كمان وحده.
من الواضح انه هذه الحركه كانت لترهيبنا، كانت لتخويفنا، الا انه بنقول لهم دائما وابدا مهما فعلتم سنبقى في منازلنا صامدين مرابطين، لانه لا احد في العالم يرضى ان يخرج من منزله ويسلمه لسارق، لا احد.
Muna al-Kurd is just one of dozens of activists and journalists arrested and interrogated by the Israelis since the so-called ceasefire went into effect. Tariq Nafi has been following the story for us. Tariq, what's behind this latest crackdown on Palestinians? What are the Israelis saying about it?
Well, in the case of Muna al-Kurd and her brother Mohammed, they're accused of things like participating in riots or disturbing the peace. But there really is no peace for Palestinians. As you mentioned, ordinary people, activists and journalists are being rounded up violently, often in full view of TV cameras. The Israeli police have said it openly. They're out to restore deterrence, and in Jerusalem, we've seen what that means. Najwan Simri, a Palestinian reporter with Al Jazeera Arabic, was hospitalized after this encounter with Israeli security forces. And here is Al Jazeera's Javad al-Budairi, a reporter with more than 20 years' experience in Jerusalem. Her hand was broken by Israeli forces and she was assaulted in the back of a police car. This is what she was told when she arrived at the police station.
One of the soldiers told me, we will let you shut up, you, all of Al Jazeera, here on the ground, so all the journalists will shut up. If we let Al Jazeera be silent, everyone will shut up.
The Israelis clearly don't like the coverage of this oppression, but how do you stop the messengers when there are so many of them?
Well, with more violence, more arrests, more intimidation, which will only generate more headlines, it seems completely illogical. But here's the thing, up until now, that strategy has worked. Israel's occupation, its settlement policy, its building demolitions, they are illegal, but they've been persisted with because of international impunity. But the narrative abroad, if not the politics, is starting to shift, and not in Israel's favor. Just this week, more than 250 journalists from some of the top media outlets in the world signed a letter addressed to their own industry, saying the, quote, sanitizing of Israel's systematic oppression of Palestinians must stop. And this aspect is telling, Richard. A number of reporters who signed that letter from outlets like The Washington Post, CNN, and ABC did so anonymously, calling for fact-based reporting on Palestine, especially in the US media, can be professionally costly, even career-ending. The letter cites rights groups like Human Rights Watch and Salem that have joined Palestinians in using terms like apartheid and ethnic supremacy. It says journalists need to examine whether their coverage reflects that reality.
Thanks, Tariq. Human rights groups are another critically important source of news content and context on this story. Salem is an Israeli human rights organization that documents violations in the occupied territories. Its executive director joins us now. Hagai El-Ad, thanks for speaking with us here at the Listening Post today.
Thank you for having me.
We heard earlier in the program about Muna and Mohammed al-Kurd, the video testimony that they've been providing that's all over social media. How much of that material are Israeli audiences seeing? Is it making any kind of impact there?
Very little, if any at all. And this is also like a very typical situation where the media in Israel, almost all of it, except very few other examples, tends to cover things in a very one-directional fashion, including, for instance, on the recent assault round bombings on Gaza. What the public here sees is very one-sided. Rockets being fired at Israeli towns, and almost zero coverage of the situation in Gaza or in the West Bank or in East Jerusalem. It's not a result of some, censorship. It's a result imposed by the government. It is a result of self-censorship by the Israeli media that is choosing only to tell part of the story, but far from the entire story, silencing the aspects of Palestinian human rights abuses.
While the bombing in Gaza has stopped for now, there's really been no ceasefire for ordinary Palestinians. In Israel itself, police have rounded up hundreds of Palestinian citizens, arrested many of them, some for simply posting an image or an opinion online. Your organization monitors human rights. What does Salem make of the measures the Israeli authorities have been taking under what the Israeli authorities call Operation Law and Order?
Yeah, it's an excellent point, and I hope that it's one that could be appreciated by your viewers, that for Palestinians living under Israeli apartheid, there's not a single second of a ceasefire. There's always one form or another in which Palestinian rights are under assault by Israeli authorities, be it inside the Green Line, inside Israel proper, or in occupied and illegally annexed East Jerusalem, or in the West Bank, or in the blockaded Gaza Strip. So there are the moments, the days, sometimes the weeks, in which there is visible violence, bombings, killings, and so on. And then there is international media attention, as indeed there should be. But when the cameras turn off, Palestinians continue to be subject to daily, routine, mundane, bureaucratic Israeli state violence through the imposition of travel restrictions and the need for permits and the knowledge that if a family member is killed or injured, then the security forces that do it will enjoy almost blanket impunity. And the million other ways in which Palestinians are abused day in and day out in this oppressive reality. And most of the time, it's invisible but for the world. But for the people that are living under the receiving edge of this reality, it's relentless, and it will not stop until we see structural change.
As part of what you call your camera project, Salem has been working with Palestinian citizens across the West Bank and Jerusalem to film and document abuses. Muna and Mohammed al-Kurd were involved as early as 2011. They were just 14 years old at the time. How does video documentation help expose the everyday violence of the occupation?
Yeah, so we've introduced about just over 10 years ago also the ability to have video footage, because there's an ongoing Israeli propaganda effort to dismiss anything that a Palestinian says as somehow false. Even if you have a number of witnesses and medical records and so on, still there will be this huge effort to dismiss and discredit. So we were hopeful that with video footage that would change that reality.
هذه حارتنا حارة الشيخ جراح. هون بيتنا اللي تم الاستيلاء عليه 3/11 10 الصبح، ما كانش في حدا في المنطقة.
And on the one hand, I think it's been a very significant success, much thanks to the courage and commitment of Palestinian volunteers that have been doing this effort to try and just document their lived experience through these video cameras.
هاي هون صار الإشي بمحض الصدفة، لا طبعاً هذا الإشي بصير يومياً.
But at the same time, it's also been another 10 years of occupation, oppression, impunity for Israelis and apartheid. That's the reality.
You just used the word apartheid. This year, Salem joined Palestinian rights groups in using that term to describe Israel's policies. You were criticized when you did that. Human Rights Watch has since joined you in doing so. Why is it so important that journalists and opinion makers covering this story use that word, apartheid?
I think first and foremost, it's important because it's correct. And the reality needs to be described in the correct way, and the analysis needs to be done on the basis of facts and not on the basis of wishful thinking. And as long as people around the world continue describing the situation here in a way that's untethered from reality, to pretend that there are two regimes here, a democracy inside the Green Line and a temporary occupation on the other side of the Green Line, as long as that's the model, democracy plus temporary occupation, then people are doing the wrong analysis and are arriving at the wrong conclusions. No, there are no two regimes here. There is one regime between the river and the sea, the rule of the government of Israel that applies the same underlying logic of advancing Jewish supremacy at the expense of the rights of Palestinians. This has a name. The name for that is apartheid, and we need to be accurate, precise, and honest in addressing this injustice if we want to end it.
Organizations like Salem, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, through your work, you help provide the frameworks for the news narratives on Palestine and Israel. You see your work show up in the journalism. From your vantage point, is the narrative changing, the international narrative on this story?
Yes, I think we are seeing those changes. And I think first and foremost, they are the result of the work of Palestinian activists that have been advancing this, and I hope that we had some modest contribution in this regard. It's late, I'd say better late than never, but I think we are seeing that this is happening. And I think in a situation which is overall bleak, like this needs to be spelled out. We shouldn't be, overly optimistic with regard to the situation here. We have a very successful, from its own perspective, oppressive regime. Again, not only because of its ability to oppress, but because of its ability successfully for decades to get away with it with impunity.
We've seen this pattern before, the unrest, the escalation, Gaza gets bombed, the disproportionate number of Palestinian casualties, the eventual ceasefire. So how should news organizations treat this story now that things have, quote unquote, returned to normal?
Don't look away. This has happened already. If I think about Gaza, and I think about 2008, 2009, and then 2012, and then 2 years later, and then a couple of weeks ago. And yes, there was a time of attention, and then attention shifted away, which means that 2 million people just went back to living in an unbearable blockade and being cut off from the rest of the planet, and so much human suffering and such an entrenched injustice, and yet again and again and again and again and again the attention shifts away. This is not a domestic Israeli issue. This is one of the most international issue in the context of human rights in the 21st century. It has to be addressed internationally, and it will not be addressed internationally if the media doesn't keep its eye watchful on the situation, even when things go back to what is wrongly often called the status quo. It is never static. It is always the advancements of the privileges of Jewish Israelis at the expense of the rights of Palestinians. It's a call really for the morality of international public opinion to wake up to the injustice here, to wake up to Israeli apartheid, and to demand change. And this can happen through the commitment of the media not to walk away from what's happening here, because it doesn't walk away from what's happening here for even a single second for Palestinians living under this reality.
Hagai El-Ad of Salem, thanks for speaking with us here at the Listening Post today.
Thank you so much.
Don't walk away or look away, as he put it, a message for the global media and those who rely on it for their news and information. Palestinians know that their fate will not be determined in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, that international media outlets based in Western capitals are the ones that have to stay on this story if real change is to occur. And if the global media turn their attention elsewhere, as they are wont to do, there's always social media. It's become the place to go for news content that holds power to account and compels mainstream news organizations to do the same. You've been watching a special edition of our program on Palestine and Israel. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.